Thank you, Roland, and good evening, everybody. Sunset over Molly Hill. Molly Hill is probably our most advanced project, and it's quite an attractive photo there at the right time of day. We won't dwell too much on the normal disclaimer. A couple of days ago, our market cap was 13 million. We've been builded in the market in the last day or so, and we're down to about 10. But hopefully, I convinced a few of you this evening to buy some shares, and we'll be back up where we should be. And our cash position is reasonably sound. I'm over here for a week talking to investors and a bunch of other people. I'm not here to raise money. Thor are basically in the tungsten business, and tungsten is not something that most prospective miners stand up to talk about. They're into gold, they're into copper, nickel, etc. Tungsten's the hardest metal there is, and if we all think of something like steel as being very hard, if you want something to cut through steel or to drill through rock, you need something really, really hard to do that, and so you put either a bit of tungsten on that or you mix a bit of tungsten in that, and that's what tungsten's very good at. It's an industrial metal. It does have some defence application as well in armaments, and it does have a little bit of a tech application, but mainly it is associated with being very, very hard. It cuts, it pokes through things, it drills through things, or you get bits of metal in gears that are rubbing against one another at some pressure. Tungsten withstands that pressure and doesn't wear out all that quickly. It's a metal for which there are very, very few substitutes. The other commodity we've got at Molly Hill is molybdenum. Molybdenum's used in the higher quality stainless steels and is often a substitute for nickel. When the price of nickel goes up, because that is also used in stainless steels, people start to use a little more molybdenum instead, and the price of molybdenum has gone up quite nicely over the last couple of years. Finally, in one project in Australia, we've got some copper. Very interesting project, we'll talk about that shortly, and while the price of copper has gone down a little bit over the last month or three, don't get too concerned about that. The outlook for copper, in my view and in the view of the people that forecast these things, is pretty positive. I think I've told you all about that, so we'll move on. First project, Molly Hill, in the Northern Territory of Australia, probably quite some distance away from the coast. Most people, when they're looking for mining projects, look for a project that has the ingredients that will make it cheap and therefore cost effective to mine, and often that is, it's close to infrastructure. I'm sad to say, I'm here to report, we don't have that. We're a long way from infrastructure. What we do have though is one of the highest grade open cut tungsten businesses in the globe, and that's what saves Molly Hill and what makes it very, very cost effective. We've just completed a feasibility study on Molly Hill in about 3 weeks ago, I guess, 4 weeks ago, and that says that we're going to earn a couple of $100 million US or just underneath it. We need $43 million US to build the plant. We pay that $43 million and some other money back in 18 months. That's not a bad outcome. And the operating cost, $90 a metric tonne unit. A metric tonne unit is 10 kilos of metal. Who invented this measure? I don't know, they need shooting, but metric tonne units is what is the measure. The current price of tungsten is about $300 a metric tonne unit. So, oops, I'll go back. So if we get to the stage where prices go down, and as they do in the cycle, in the life of a mine, when prices go down, a lot of people will be hurting before we will be. We've got a mine life of 7 years, and I'll talk to you shortly about why this mine life will go much, much longer than that. There's a fairly busy table of lots of things about the project. Internal rate of return of 59%, a net present value of 100 million Aussie, life of mine EBITDA of $239 million. Lots and lots of stuff there. I talked about the grade, 0.29% WO3, which is WO3 is tungsten trioxide. Doesn't sound much, does it? That doesn't sound like a high grade. This stuff's worth $30,000 a tonne. That's why it's that's why this grade is quite payable. Over here on the on this chart, and I'll show it to you again later, this is the first couple of years' revenue versus our cost line coming across here. It drops a bit in year 3 as we cut the pit back and put some low-grade ore through from the stockpile through the system. I'll take you on to the next slide, and that where we repeat this this graph. We've got a gap here where we'd like to fill, and we'd like to push these lines up here in the back end of the years and move this over, and we're going to do that. We believe we can steepen the pit slopes. That gets our costs down. We know there is underground potential further on, and there are some satellite resources that are close by that don't form part of the ore reserve and therefore can't form part of the feasibility. And here they are. Here's Molly Hill, and about 30 kilometres from there is in this odd-looking square is a tenement that we call Bonya. And I've been trying to get my grubby little paws on Bonya since 2012. And earlier on this year, we finally managed to do a deal to acquire a 40% interest in this and management of that project. At Bonya, there are 13 outcropping deposits of tungsten. We don't have to go looking for them. We know where they are. They stick out of the ground. We've sampled them. Some of them have been drilled. None of them, however, have been drilled since the 1970s. It's not hard to see how 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those will supplement the production of Molly Hill because it's 30 odd kilometres away, very easy trucking distance. What we also have at Bonya, that we pick up at, it's a bit like throwing steak knives in with a deal, is a little small but rather high-grade copper project called Bonya Copper. And our process at Molly Hill in producing tungsten and molybdenum will also extract the copper quite comfortably. We have a flotation process for which copper is the normal form of extraction. We also have over here in a checkerboarded, because it's a checkerboard type tenement, there's a vanadium and titanium deposit that we don't know a lot about. There's been some drilling done on it, but again, that's been thrown in basically for the cost of picking up these 13 tungsten deposits. We're probably not going to do much with that vanadium and titanium thing for a little while. We need to understand it. We're certainly going to go and drill some of those tungsten deposits very, very quickly. That's what makes me believe and me very excited about the fact that Molly Hill is not a 7-year project, it's more like 17. The resource around there, 4.7 million tonnes, that sort of grade we talk about. And the molybdenum also doesn't seem all that high grade, but this stuff's worth $26,000 a tonne. You know, these are high grade commodities. You don't need to produce a lot of them to make a reasonable amount of money. We have some processes going through. Ore sorting improves the grade of the material before it goes into the most expensive part of the plant to build and to operate. You crush it, you put this stuff on a belt, it gets x-rayed, and the stuff you don't want gets blown that way by a puff of air. The stuff that you do want goes on into the feed. Pretty clever stuff, and it upgrades the quality of your ore by about 60% before you have to spend an awful lot of money on it. That's the geology, a couple of relatively vertical bodies, and I'm going to keep skipping on or Roland's going to get cross with me. Here we go in our capital cost of building that up in the feasibility study. Our friends at Northland have put out a graph that says this is where Molly Hill is. It's compared with the other hopefuls. Yeah, we're about where we should be. More importantly, in the operating costs, this is where we are compared with the rest, right down towards the bottom, and that's on the basis of we have a very high grade deposit. There's our flow sheet. Won't spend much time on that, but it's standard mineral processing: crush, grind, float, and put it in a bag and send it off to people who want to buy this stuff. That's the Molly Hill pit as it currently looks. This was mined back in the late 70s, early 80s. We don't have to do a big cut back to get at the ore. It's there sitting there waiting for us to get at it again. And the last thing before I move on to across the other side of the globe is that from the time we get finance, and we're looking for that finance right now, the construction period at Molly Hill is 12 months. Moving on to Pilot Mountain in Nevada. Another tungsten deposit with copper, silver and zinc associated with it. Pilot Mountain is probably about a third of the way down on the main road between Reno and Las Vegas. Quite a pretty looking outlook there, and yeah, it's the view from those hills looking out across the valley is quite spectacular. In winter it's awfully cold because it's about 7,000 feet up. We've just completed a scoping study at Pilot Mountain on two that affects 2 of the 4 known deposits. That says that at the low end of the scale, it'll make about $125 million US and a payback of 2.5 years. At the high end of the scale, if we add in garnet and get a few things right, it goes up quite a bit. And if we do even better, we manage to improve our recoveries and a few things like that, that $200 goes up to nearly $400. $200 million goes up to nearly 400. This is tungsten, again, in the main, and there are no producing tungsten mines in the United States. In fact, there are none in North America at the moment. There is only one other compliant resource or reportable resource of tungsten in the United States, and that is quite a bit smaller than this one. And lo and behold, the US has classified tungsten as a critical mineral. Now, they've done that for a little while, and I don't expect that Donald Trump's going to ring me up next week and say, Mick, we want this project from you. But it's not a bad position to be in. It is it's quite a large resource by global standards, and it is in a commodity that the US has identified as saying they want some more of that domestically. Most of the world's tungsten is produced in China. The US doesn't want to get most of its tungsten from China. There are 4 deposits. Desert scheelite the largest. Then we have garnet. We also have a small resource on that. Good hope we should have a resource on that in the next little while. And then there's another one, gunmetal, that we really haven't had much of a chance to look at. Union Carbide had this project back in the 1970s. They moved away from it because the price of tungsten collapsed, not because they ran out of things to explore. They had their own resource estimates on all of these, but that's some time ago. Here's the resource estimate for desert scheelite, 26,000 tonnes of contained tungsten. And for garnet, 6,500, 30,000 tonnes, 33,000 tonnes of contained tungsten at about $30,000 a tonne. There's over $1 billion US worth of stuff in the ground here. Now, we're not going to get all of that out when we mine it, because you don't get it all, but it's not a bad place to start from. So we've just finished the scoping study on Pilot Mountain. We are now going into what we call pre-feasibility. We've done some test work that says, in the lab, that says we can produce a concentrate, a tungsten concentrate that can be sold, and a copper-silver concentrate that can be sold. Union Carbide many years ago also demonstrated you could produce a zinc-silver concentrate that can be sold. We're going through the next stage of that now to get that test work to the stage where we can produce a costed flow sheet and equipment specifications for pre-feasibility. And we're doing the permitting and things of that nature. That'll take a year or so, and that will cost a little bit of money, but it doesn't cost a lot. The expensive spend is behind us because the exploration work is done. We don't need to do an awful lot more drilling in the ground to find out what we've got. This resource that I just pointed out will grow. It'll grow quite substantially, but when you've got somewhere between 12 or 13 years of mine life, we can do some of that later on out of profits. Finally, back in South Australia at Kapunda. Now, Kapunda is, for those of you who know or have heard of the Barossa Valley, one of the world's better known wine areas. Kapunda is about 20 minutes north of that. But what Kapunda is also, it's the original home of copper mining in Australia. In the 1800s, a bunch of people were digging copper out of the ground, very, very high-grade copper, putting on a boat and sending it back here to the UK to be processed. What they left behind was a halo of copper that is probably not practical to be extracted by conventional mining methods anymore. It's right right on the edge of town, and it's relatively low grade. What it is good at, what it is or does appear to be very suitable for though, is in situ leaching, or in situ recovery as we call it. And we'll talk about that. We've got the Australian government relatively excited about this process, and they've given us $2.5 million of government money to demonstrate that it's feasible. There's a number of technical boxes we have to tick with to make sure this works. In situ leaching or in situ recovery is very, very cheap way to extract minerals if it works. You need a certain set of conditions to make it work. So far we're ticking all those boxes. We've still got a couple more to go, but so far it's looking very, very positive, and we look forward to doing the rest. We have a resource on Kapunda, on that part of the copper deposit that is amenable to in situ recovery. The entire resource is quite a bit larger, but what you call the primary or the sulphide copper is not suitable for in situ recovery. What is almost 120,000 tonnes of contained copper. That's almost $750 million US worth of copper. It's a big number, and this is very, very cheap to do if we get it right. This slide talks about the resource at a slightly higher grade. We still have most of the tonnes. I won't delve into that because Roland will get cross with me. In situ recovery is not common with copper. It is carried out in the USSR, in Russia as it's now called, and also in Arizona and a couple of sites in the United States. In situ recovery is a method by which probably 50% of the world's uranium is produced, and quite a bit of the world's potash is produced that way. It's not used often in copper, but it does work because it's been demonstrated elsewhere. The process is that you inject a solution into the ground through a borehole. It's like a water bore, and from boreholes around it you pump out, and that solution of what is known as a lixiviant dissolves the copper in the ground, and if you've got the right porosity and permeability, it will travel through to the other spread out, and the other boreholes will pull it out. You pump it out. What do you use to dissolve the copper? There are a number of things. One is sulfuric acid, a mild sulfuric acid solution. The CSIRO in Australia has developed a product called thiosulfate, which also dissolves copper. Our most recent trials have been using an amino acid called glycine, which dissolves copper quite successfully, and we announced a few weeks ago we got about a 78% recovery using glycine. Glycine, amongst other things, is used to stick breadcrumbs onto fish fingers. It's a pretty mild sort of stuff. It's not all that corrosive. I wouldn't drink the stuff, but that's what it does. So we've got this money from the Australian government, and I've got 1 minute left. We have done a whole bunch of work on core samples, on hydrogeological modelling. We've got the next stage is some flow modelling through the solution, some pump testing. We will probably start that in the next couple of months, and then some field recovery trials. We expect that the money we've got from the Australian government, that 2.8 million, with about best part of $1 million, part of which we have put in, and what we are yet to put in, will take this through to feasibility. The cost of taking this through to feasibility for shareholders and for Thor is very modest, largely because the Australian taxpayer is helping us out with this. And we think it's a cracking project, we really do. There's our program on these projects for the next little while. We've got a lot to do. We're a very small team. We're funded for until probably around the middle of next year. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Mick, please? Gentleman at the front here, please, Peter.
Now, can I ask you two questions? One, on your corporate structure. Are you primarily listing in Australia or the UK? What's your split between investors between UK and Australia? And would you ever consider bringing your primary listing over to AIM as opposed to ASX? And the second question is, for your Alice Springs operation, how do you handle the heat?
Let me deal with the first one, and I'll come back to you on the second because I didn't quite get it. But the first one, our primary listing is AIM. We are a PLC company. We are registered in the UK, and our first listing is AIM. And so our securities trade in Australia as CDIs. So this is our primary listing, and I would say that probably 75% of our shares are here in the UK, 25 in Australia. So now your second question.
How do you handle the heat in Alice Springs? Does it affect your operation?
Not at all. It does get a bit warm from time to time. The summers are not quite balmy. The average temperature during summer is probably closer to 45 than 35. But it's a dry heat. We don't have the humidity. I'm much more comfortable, and I did live in the tropics for a number of years in my 20s. I'm much more comfortable at 40 degrees where it's very dry than at 32 or 33 degrees where it's very, very humid.
So it doesn't affect your machinery at all?
Not at all. There are mining projects in Australia and in Africa and and other parts of the world where these temperatures are not unusual. You organise yourselves. You make sure your employees use sunscreen. You make sure they drink a lot, preferably water, not beer, and you've got to look after them. But yeah, it's not a big issue. You gear up for it. I have a colleague who many years ago had a mine going in a part of Russia, and to get to that mine they had to wait until winter when the river froze over so they could drive up the river. I reckon Alice Springs is much more gentle on the system than that.
Any other questions, please? I wanted to ask about kind of the financing conditions. When we first started doing these sorts of events 6 or 7 years ago, mining companies would say we need to raise $250 million. The project scale was very grand, and I don't know if they ever realised those ambitions. But the money you're looking for is 30 million, it's 40 million, it's a lot more modest. What are the conditions overall for mine financing?
Look, sometimes if you want to borrow an enormous amount of money, it's easier than if you want to borrow a small amount. Our project, the finance requirement is small because these are low volume and high value compared with coal or iron ore, where it's all about shifting an awful lot of material. Some of the finance that we are looking to get from, we believe we can get from the people who want to buy our concentrates, because they don't want to get it all from China. And so there are other examples in the tungsten industry, for example, where the people who have offtake agreements for those concentrates actually put a bit of money in to help out by way of loan funding. And then there are, of course, all the other normal debt mechanisms. But if you get an offtake partner to say, well, look, I'm good for a certain amount, that gives the rest of the market some confidence that it's worth financing.
Lovely, thank you. On that note, we are going to wrap up. Thank you very much indeed, Mick. Thank you.